At 9:17 on the morning of January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched in the wet ruins of a captured Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. Around him, the Guadalcanal jungle dripped with the silence that follows sustained terror. In the previous 72 hours, 11 enemy snipers operating from the coastal groves had killed 14 men of the 132nd Infantry Regiment. Their bodies had been dragged back along mud trails, their canteens still swinging from pack hooks, letters from home folded into helmet liners. The battalion was bleeding out not from massed assault, but from a handful of invisible riflemen who had turned the banyan trees into vertical killing floors. George pressed his eye to the scope of a rifle that, 6 weeks earlier, his own commanding officer had called a toy. The Winchester Model 70 was a civilian hunting weapon he had purchased with 2 years of National Guard pay. Its Lyman Alaskan scope, a mere 2.5 power, had been mocked by fellow platoon leaders as a mail-order sweetheart. The United States Army had issued every other man in the battalion a semi-automatic M1 Garand, a battle rifle that spat 8 rounds as fast as a finger could pull the trigger. George carried a bolt-action, 5-round magazine, a glass-smooth trigger, and a set of skills that the industrialized military machine had not yet learned to value. In that bunker, as the jungle heat thickened the air, he was about to prove that a state champion marksman with a personally purchased scope could dismantle an entire enemy sniper network using tactics the field manuals had never written down. He glassed the tree line, found the first dark shape 87 feet up a banyan, and began to squeeze. This is the declassified case file of a rifle that changed the calculus of individual combat. The story does not begin in the mud of Guadalcanal. It begins on the measured firing lines of Camp Perry, Ohio, in 1939. John George was 23 years old, the youngest competitor ever to win the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards. He was not a soldier then, just a man who understood that precision was not a gift but a discipline. He could place 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, reading wind mirage across open fields the way a sailor reads swell patterns. When war ignited, that discipline followed him into the National Guard and onto a troop ship bound for the Pacific. Before deployment at Camp Forest, Tennessee, George unpacked a wooden crate containing a Winchester Model 70 chambered in .3006 Springfield, the same cartridge the Garand fired. He had fitted it with a Griffin and Howe mount and a Lyman Alaskan scope. The armorer, a practical man who had spent his career inspecting mass-produced military weapons, looked at the sleek blued steel and walnut stock and asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. George replied without irony that it was for the Japanese. The armorer shook his head. The rifle was bolt-action. It held 5 rounds. It weighed 9 pounds before the scope added another 12 ounces. By comparison, the M1 Garand weighed 9.5 pounds and offered 8 rounds of semi-automatic firepower with no glass to fog or crack. On paper, George was bringing a thoroughbred to an assembly line. The other platoon leaders saw only a vanity piece. Captain Morris, his company commander, ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway, a decision that would soon alter the tactical geometry of Point Cruz. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had relieved the weary 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal in late December 1942. The Marines had seized Henderson Field and held it through months of brutal attrition, but 2 critical objectives remained unfulfilled. Mount Austin, a 1,514-foot eminence the Japanese called Gifu, still bristled with 500 defenders and 47 interconnected bunkers. And the coastal groves west of the Matanika River, a tangle of banyan, palm, and mangrove, sheltered an unknown number of enemy soldiers who had retreated from the airfield and simply melted into the vegetation. Among them were snipers armed with scoped Arisaka Type 97 rifles, men who had been fighting since August, who knew the jungle as an extension of their nervous systems. They did not fight for territory any longer. They fought to make every American advance cost more blood than any strategic gain was worth. George's battalion assaulted Mount Austin on December 17th. For 16 days, they clawed up that killing slope against bunkers constructed of interlocking coconut logs and camouflaged so perfectly that American artillery often detonated harmlessly in the canopy. 34 men were killed, 279 wounded. George did not fire his Winchester once during that battle. There was no line of sight, no clear engagement beyond the flash of muzzle fire from hidden loopholes. The rifle stayed slung across his back, a dead weight that reinforced every joke made at his expense. It was not until the regiment pushed west, into the sniper-infested groves of Point Cruz, that the conditions of combat shifted into a shape his weapon could exploit. The Japanese snipers operated with a doctrine that had been honed in the jungles of Malaya and the rice paddies of China. They worked in pairs, shooter and spotter, lashed to high branches before dawn using climbing spikes and rope harnesses. They urinated into cloth pads to avoid giving away position by sound. They controlled their breathing so precisely that a man standing directly beneath a tree might never detect a heartbeat 80 feet above his helmet. Their rifles, the Type 97, were chambered in 6.5 x 50 Marisaka, a cartridge with a flat trajectory and very little muzzle flash. They had killed 14 Americans in 3 days, targeting men filling canteens at creeks, men on patrol, men who walked the same trail twice. The psychological impact was immediate and corrosive. Every shadow in the canopy became a potential death sentence. Movement slowed to a crawl. The battalion's operational tempo collapsed. On the night of January 21st, the battalion commander summoned George. The conversation was stripped of ceremony. Japanese snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He had heard about the mail-order rifle. He wanted to know if it could actually hit anything. George recited his credentials: the state championship, the Camp Perry records, the 4-inch 5-round groups at 300 yards with the scope dialed in. The commander gave him until dawn to prove it. That night, George stripped the Winchester, cleaned every trace of cosmoline from its action, verified the scope mounts for the 100th time, and loaded 5 rounds of the commercial hunting ammunition he had packed from Tennessee. He did not sleep. He sat with the rifle across his lap, mentally rehearsing the geometry of the groves, the angle of the morning sun, the probable positions an enemy sniper would select. His weapon was a precision instrument, but the battlefield was a chaos equation. The variable he had not yet solved was whether a man trained to punch paper at 1,000 yards could perform the same mechanical ritual while another man actively hunted him back. Dawn on January 22nd broke thick with humidity. George moved into position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had seized 3 days earlier. The structure offered a commanding view of the coconut groves and the massive banyan trees that intelligence reports identified as sniper hides. He carried no spotter, no radioman, just the Winchester, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. The jungle orchestra of birds, insects, and distant artillery created a constant auditory fog. George had learned to filter that noise the way a sonarman filters out the ocean static, focusing exclusively on anomaly, movement where there should be none, silhouette where branches should meet uninterrupted sky. He glassed the trees slowly, left to right, top to bottom, pausing on every fork, every shadow that could resolve into a shoulder or a head. The Lyman Alaskan's 2.5 power magnification was modest by any standard. It demanded patience, the same patience he had cultivated at 1,000 yards when the target was a black circle on white paper. At 9:17, a branch shifted. No wind. Just a small, unnatural tremor 87 feet up a banyan 240 yards distant. George froze the scope. The shape resolved. Dark clothing, a human form nested where 3 branches diverged, facing east, watching the supply trail where American soldiers would soon appear. The Japanese sniper had no idea he was being observed. George adjusted 2 clicks right for the faint crosswind, controlled his breathing and laid his finger on the trigger. The Winchester's trigger broke at 3.5 pounds, a glass rod crispness he had spent hours refining at Camp Perry. The rifle bucked. The crack rolled across the groves. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked, pitched forward and tumbled 90 feet through branches before striking the jungle floor. George worked the bolt. The empty casing spun into the mud. He chambered another round without taking his eye from the scope. A fundamental rule of sniper engagement had been violated in that moment. The sniper's partner was still somewhere in the tree or in the adjacent grove. Japanese sniper pairs were not merely teammates. They were a symbiotic unit. If George had killed the shooter, the spotter was already reacting, already processing the sound signature, already deciding whether to flee or counter-engage. George swung his scope to the surrounding banyans. The jungle canopy was a layered mosaic of shadow and foliage that made positive identification a slow, punishing grind. At 9:43, he found the second man. Different tree, 60 yards north, lower at approximately 50 feet, descending the trunk with the deliberate haste of a man who knows his position has been compromised. The Japanese soldier was retreating. George led the movement, fired. The sniper fell backward off the tree, his Type 97 clattering after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. He reloaded from a stripper clip, hands steady, breathing controlled, exactly as he had done hundreds of times on the range. The only difference was that the targets now carried rifles and possessed the ability to triangulate his location from muzzle flash and sound. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face and snapped him violently against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, a completely different vector. The remaining snipers had heard the Winchester's distinctive report, noted the absence of the rapid fire characteristic of an American semi-automatic, and deduced that a single marksman was hunting them. Their response was immediate and coordinated. George waited 3 full minutes before moving, using the time to control his pulse and analyze the new tactical reality. The sniper who fired would have relocated after the shot, standard doctrine. But in a jungle this dense, the options for relocation were limited. A man in a tree cannot vanish. He can only shift branches. At 11:38, George spotted him. 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of 5, 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had moved to a different fork but remained in the same tree, a critical miscalculation born perhaps from the belief that the jungle canopy would mask his silhouette. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The 3rd sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 enemy snipers. The mathematics were beginning to shift. Word spread through the battalion like a current. Men who had mocked the mail-order rifle now asked to observe. George refused. Spectators drew attention, and attention drew fire. He was not performing. He was executing a tactical clearance operation with a weapon system no one else understood. The Japanese adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight, going to ground in their hides and waiting for darkness to reposition. George spent the afternoon glassing motionless trees, the adrenaline of the morning giving way to the grinding patience that separated a true marksman from an enthusiastic shooter. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice, replaced by the flat, urgent tone of a commander who has just realized he possesses an asset he did not know he had. He ordered George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into sucking mud and reduced visibility below 100 yards. The rain was both curse and opportunity. It masked movement, allowing Japanese snipers to climb into new positions unheard. But it also meant that when the weather cleared, the enemy would be in hides George had not yet mapped. He sat in the bunker, soaked to the bone, and waited. At 8:15, the rain lifted. By 8:45, visibility had recovered enough for work. At 9:12, he spotted the first sniper of the day at 290 yards, longer range than any engagement the previous day. The enemy was learning his capabilities, pushing the distance to a margin where the Winchester's ballistic advantage over the Arisaka still held, but only barely. George compensated for the drop, fired, and recorded his 6th kill. What happened next was the inevitable counterpunch of an intelligent adversary. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began walking rounds toward the bunker. The enemy had triangulated his firing position, likely from muzzle flash, sound, or dust signature, and was delivering a concentrated barrage. The first salvo landed 40 yards short. The second, 20 yards short. George recognized the bracketing pattern instantly. The third salvo would be on target. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater as the bunker behind him erupted in a cascade of earth and shattered coconut logs. If he had hesitated 3 more seconds, the story would have ended there. A forgotten lieutenant buried in an unmarked fighting position on a jungle island. Instead, he relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north, settled in, and resumed his hunt. The duel had changed its character. George was no longer shooting at stationary targets. He was now engaged in a two-way war of maneuver against opponents who knew his approximate location and were actively hunting him back. That afternoon, he killed his 7th sniper at 14:23 and his 8th at 15:41. This 8th man had climbed to 94 feet, a near-suicidal height chosen for superior concealment, but the sun's shifting angle had silhouetted him against the sky like a paper target tacked against a white backing. George exploited the error without hesitation. When he returned to headquarters at 1700, Captain Morris asked for numbers. 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 4 misses, all in the early engagements before he fully acclimated to the environment. Morris did not hesitate. He assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24th and gave him the authority to select his own positions and engagement timelines. That night, George cleaned his rifle by lamplight and considered the arithmetic. 11 Japanese snipers originally identified, 8 now dead, 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the survivors, the ones who had learned, the ones who would not repeat the mistakes of their dead comrades. They knew what George looked like. They knew what rifle he carried, and they had all night to plan his death. Rain began again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was a punishing downpour that delayed any possibility of dawn operations. George used the time to conduct a tactical appreciation that would have impressed any staff college instructor. He could not return to the bunker. The Japanese knew that location. He could not use the fallen tree, too obvious. He needed a position the enemy would not predict, one that offered cover, overlapping fields of fire, and a firing angle the Japanese snipers had not previously encountered. He selected a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south of his previous positions, a former Marine machine gun nest abandoned in December. The rocks provided elevation and a natural defilade. He settled in as the rain slowed to a drizzle at 7:43 and began glassing the groves. At 8:17, he found sniper number 9. This one was positioned in a palm tree at only 40 feet, unusually low. The palm fronds created a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level, but George's elevated angle on the rocks gave him a downward view into the fronds. He could see the sniper's shoulders and head clearly. He aimed, controlled his breathing, and began his trigger squeeze. Then he stopped. A cold, instinctive alarm cut through the moment of certainty. The position was too exposed, too perfectly positioned for an elevated shooter to spot. He had been hunting these men for 3 days. He had killed 8 of them. The 3 who remained would not make elementary errors. They would not place themselves where an elevated observer could acquire them so cleanly unless that position was bait. George lowered his rifle and began a systematic scan of the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was a decoy, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for the muzzle flash of anyone who took the shot. It took him 11 minutes to find the real threat, a banyan tree 91 feet up, 80 yards northwest of the palm, a perfect hide concealed on three sides by branches and vines. The Japanese sniper had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for the American marksman to appear at that known location or to fire at the decoy, at which point he would place a round through the source of the muzzle flash. It was a textbook counter-sniper ambush, executed with patience and cunning. George faced two immediate problems. If he fired at the real sniper, the sound would reveal his current position and the sniper would relocate before he could cycle the bolt. If he did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize the ambush had failed and begin searching. George chose a third option. He would use the decoy to trigger a predictable reaction. He aimed at the sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The decoy jerked and fell. George immediately swung his rifle onto the banyan. The real sniper, hearing the shot from an unexpected direction, instinctively turned to face the new threat. That turn created the movement George needed. He placed the crosshairs on the shifting silhouette and fired before the sniper could complete his orientation. The second body fell 91 feet. 2 shots, 2 kills, but George had now unequivocally revealed his new position to any other observer in the groves. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted east along the rock line, dropping into a drainage ditch 40 yards away and pressing himself into the mud. 6 seconds later, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been positioned. The fire lasted 17 seconds, kicking up stone fragments and dust. George counted to 60 before moving again, then relocated to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater 100 yards east. He settled into the crater with water up to his chest, rested the Winchester on the rim, and resumed glassing. 10 confirmed kills. 1 remaining sniper, the 11th, the best, the one who had watched 10 comrades die and had spent 3 days studying the single man responsible. At 9:47, George realized his fundamental error. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground, low-crawling through the undergrowth, using ferns and fallen branches for cover, moving toward George's last known position at the rocks. The Japanese soldier had abandoned the vertical doctrine entirely, deducing that the American marksman's advantage lay in his ability to spot targets in the canopy. He was now closing the distance, hunting George on the ground the way George had hunted his men in the trees. George remained motionless in the crater, water seeping into his uniform, the Winchester shouldered but the angle wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. He would have to rise to get a clear shot, and rising would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped at 35 yards from the rocks, then 25, then moved into the machine gun nest itself. He took up a position facing east, toward the drainage ditch, scanning for movement. His back was exposed to George at a range of only 38 yards. It was an easy shot, center mass, almost impossible to miss. But George hesitated. This man had survived for 10 days. He had outlived 10 other snipers, all killed because they made mistakes. This one would not present himself so vulnerably unless he was another layer of bait. George expanded his scan and found the confirmation at 10:06. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. Rifle aimed at the drainage ditch, motionless. 2 men working a coordinated kill box. The 11th sniper had brought a partner, or these were the final 2 snipers operating together, adapting their tactics in real time to the threat George represented. George could not shoot both men before the survivor returned fire. The Winchester's bolt-action mechanism imposed a 6-second cycle time between aimed shots under combat stress. That was more than enough for a trained rifleman to acquire and engage. He submerged himself deeper into the crater until only his eyes and the crown of his head remained above the surface. The Winchester held vertically to keep water from the barrel. He waited. At 10:13, the soldier in the rock stood up. 10 minutes of watching the drainage ditch had yielded nothing. He signaled to his partner. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart, executing a sweep to flush George from concealment. They walked past his crater, their backs now exposed to a man submerged in muddy water. George rose slowly, water streaming from his uniform, his face, the barrel of his rifle. He aimed at the closer soldier, 42 yards away, and fired. The man dropped. He worked the bolt, swung to the second soldier who was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. The groves of Point Cruz had been cleared of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed from the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard voices. Japanese voices, multiple men moving from the tree line toward the fallen soldiers. The snipers had not been working alone. An infantry patrol, at least 6 men, was advancing to recover the bodies. George dropped back into the crater, water closing over him, the Winchester held vertical. The voices grew louder, stopped at the first body, then the second. Then they began moving again, not away but toward the crater. They had found his boot prints in the mud. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim and looked directly down at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. He worked the bolt, chambered another round, rose up to find 2 more soldiers at the rim. He fired, cycled, fired again. Both dropped. 3 rounds remained. Shouting erupted from the jungle. More soldiers were converging. George climbed out the north side of the crater and sprinted 20 yards to a fallen tree. Rifle fire cracked through the vegetation. Bullets struck the ground around him, snapped past his head, kicked up dirt. He stayed low, glassed the area, saw 2 soldiers advancing on the crater. He fired, dropping the lead man. The second dove for cover. 2 rounds left. He heard voices behind him now. The Japanese were flanking, one group from the south, another from the east. He was about to be surrounded. He could not win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple semi-automatic weapons. He grabbed his rifle and ran north, sprinting through the undergrowth while bullets stripped leaves and gouged bark around him. 90 seconds later, he dove into another shell crater, this one dry and pressed against the wall. The Japanese voices faded. The enemy had not pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle, mud on the stock, water in the barrel, 2 rounds remaining, no stripper clips. He began moving again, walking this time, using terrain for cover, and reached the American perimeter at 11:13. Captain Morris debriefed him. 11 snipers killed. 12 rounds fired against the snipers, 11 hits. 3 additional infantry engaged at close range, all confirmed. George was down to his last 2 cartridges. Morris told him to clean his rifle and rest. Then Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, arrived with a question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require rifles with optics and men who could already shoot. Ferry provided 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes, left behind by the Marines, and 40 men from the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen. George accepted with one condition: he would keep his Winchester. Training began on January 27, 1943. George assembled the 40 marksmen at a makeshift range east of Henderson Field and stripped away every assumption they held about combat shooting. He taught them that the jungle would never offer a perfect shooting position. They learned to build stable platforms from rocks, logs, and sandbags. They fired at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards, then at moving targets, then at shapes partially obscured by vegetation. Within 3 days, 32 of the 40 could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George organized them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, providing security and target acquisition. After each kill, the roles could switch, preventing the single point of failure that came from relying on a single shooter. The sniper section entered active operations on February 1st. George paired with Corporal Hayes and led 4 teams into the field west of the Matanico. That first day, the teams engaged and killed 23 Japanese soldiers, 0 American casualties. By February 9th, when the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal, the The section had amassed 74 confirmed kills. The number was conservative, counting only bodies that could be visually confirmed. The tactical impact was disproportionate. An entire regiment had struggled for weeks to neutralize a handful of enemy marksmen. A single man with a civilian rifle had dismantled that threat in 4 days, then scaled his methodology into a unit that continued the clearance operation. The Winchester Model 70 had demonstrated a brutal truth that military procurement systems were slow to acknowledge. Industrial standardization produces adequate weapons for the average soldier, but individual marksmanship, amplified by precision equipment, creates force multipliers that no logistics table can quantify. George's war did not end on Guadalcanal. He recovered from a bullet wound to the shoulder, received from a Japanese rifleman near the Tambo River on February 7th, and volunteered for a classified mission in Burma. By April 1943, he was training with the 5,307th Composite Unit, the men who would become known as Merrill's Marauders. The mission was long-range penetration behind Japanese lines, a brutal campaign that covered over 700 miles of mountainous jungle to capture the Mi'kina airfield. George carried his Winchester, now modified with a lighter Weaver 330 scope and synthetic stock, reducing weight to just under 9 pounds. He used it only 7 times in 3 months of operations. The Burma jungle imposed engagement ranges of 50 yards or less, where the Winchester's precision was superfluous. He learned what all snipers eventually learn. The weapon is only as effective as the operational environment allows. Yet the principles he had validated on Point Cruz, patience, fieldcraft, the symbiotic relationship between shooter and spotter, formed the intellectual scaffolding for every American sniper program that followed. John George never fired the Winchester in combat again. He returned to the United States, wrote a book titled Shots Fired in Anger that remains a classic reference among military historians, and spent the rest of his career in the Foreign Service, speaking little of his war. The rifle that had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, and likely more, was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case, looking like any other vintage hunting rifle, its placard describing a story most visitors pass by without reading. But inside that steel and walnut is a question that still echoes through modern military doctrine. How do you measure the value of a single man who can see what no one else sees, and place a shot that no one else can make? The industrial answer is to build 1,000 rifles and train 1,000 men to be good enough. The legacy of John George suggests a different calculus, one that challenges us to ask whether true tactical supremacy lies not in the volume of fire, but in the cold, quiet convergence of skill, equipment, and the will to remain motionless in a water-filled crater while history pivots on the placement of a crosshair.